Hi, my name is Jackie. I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes when I was 8. I play hard because that's how I do everything. I always push myself to be the best that I can be. Type 1 diabetes does not stop me from doing the things that I like to do.
Hello and welcome to Teen 1D, the podcast for teenagers and young adults living with type 1 diabetes. The podcast is not intended as a substitute for professional medicine advice or treatment. Our guest for today's episode is Dana Lewis, and I'll have her introduce herself.
Hi everyone, my name is Dana Lewis. I've been living with type 1 diabetes for almost 19 years, and I'm one of the founders and creators of the first open source artificial pancreas system, which we call OpenAPS.
Can you tell us about APS for our listeners who don't know?
Yeah, so an artificial pancreas system is really a hybrid closed loop or fully closed loop system where you're bridging the communications between a continuous glucose monitor and an insulin pump. Traditionally, those two devices didn't talk to each other and they didn't know what each other were doing. So what a closed loop system does is has an algorithm that reads data from both devices, decides, do you need more or less insulin, tells the pump to give that much insulin, and then factors that back into its calculations and does it over and over again.
So let's backtrack a little bit. How long have you been living with type 1?
19 years.
When you were first diagnosed, what did you use? Because I know that you're right now working with the APS system, but what did you do before that?
When I was first diagnosed, I did finger sticks with a giant meter that's bigger than today's biggest iPhone and syringes, and did multiple daily injections for about a year. And then I went on an insulin pump, still using finger sticks. And I think about 4 or 5 years after I went on a pump, the first CGM was available and I started using that intermittently.
So I've heard you speak before about the APS system. Can you tell us the problem that you were trying to solve with that and how you got the idea to start making one yourself?
So I didn't set out to build an APS or a closed loop system. I wanted to solve a problem I had with my continuous glucose monitor, which was that I could not hear the alarms, especially at night. And it was partially a volume issue, but it was also that my brain had alarm fatigue from hearing these alarms day in, day out for 10 to 12 years at that point, and just would not wake up to the alarms. And I had asked the manufacturers, the companies who made the CGMs, can I change the alarm? Can you make it louder? And they said, oh yeah, we're working on it. It'll be out in the quote next version, which never ever came out. And so I was really looking for a way to solve the problem for myself. And so what I wanted to do was actually get the data directly off the CGM, which was a physical separate device at that point, and get it to my phone to send to an app that would make it a louder alarm. This was back before CGMs could connect via Bluetooth to your phone. Like maybe we accept that now, but that was not the case back in 2012, 2013. So that's the problem I first started to solve. And then once I actually found somebody who figured out how to get the data off the device, I built a system that took the data, sent it to the cloud, down to my phone, and made a louder alarm. And then I added a little algorithm to it that would actually predict what would happen based on me telling it what insulin I was dosing, based on that CGM data. And then it would actually give me predictive alerts and alarms saying, not just you're already low or you're already high, but you're going to go low in 30 minutes. But if you take action now, you do a small micro correction, maybe it's reduce your insulin or eat a small snack, you could potentially prevent that hypoglycemia. So that's the system that I set out to build originally. And then later on, we actually figured out that you could talk to one of the types of insulin pumps that I had in my closet. And with a small computer to bridge the radio communication and hold the algorithm, we could build a closed loop. So we went from louder alarm to building a predictive algorithm that could tell me, the human, what to do, to realizing we could convert that into a system that would tell the pump what to do and then do it automatically. So that's how I kind of set out to build a system, not by trying to build a full closed loop system.
So I know when you started this, you have no idea what it would later become. Could you just go into that and describe where it is at right now and how the system works together between the pump and the CGM?
So what we ended up doing was using an off-the-shelf computer, like a little small computer that's the size of a Tic Tac box, that we put the algorithm onto. And it also had radio communication capabilities so that it could talk to the pump and it could talk to the CGM. So that's what I have today, is this little square computer chip with radio capabilities that hangs off my pocket and talks to the pump and CGM, pulls in the data, sends commands to the pump to say, give more or less insulin, reads it back. And today I have the ability to tie that to my phone so I can use my phone to see what it's doing, tell it what to do, tell it if I'm eating or not, et cetera. But thanks to advancements in the algorithm from the community, we've been able to improve this over time, not only the hardware of the little computer that talks to the pump and the CGM, but also the algorithm capabilities. And now today we have slightly faster insulin, and that little bit of insulin being faster sometimes allows people like me to choose to do fully no bolus, no announced meals. So instead of having to say, I'm having 60 carbs, I'm taking 6 units of insulin for my meal and figure out the timing for that, you can either just enter 60 carbs and not give any insulin and the system gives the insulin for you, or you can not even enter the carbs hypothetically, or you can choose to bolus and do your meal entry. But you've got a lot more flexibility now with these systems because they've come such a long way compared to in the early days when we first built it. We assumed it would be a hybrid closed loop system and that the human would handle the meal bolusing and get that roughly right, and the system would clean up around the edges. But we found a lot of people in the community didn't want to do that. And so we started designing and figuring out, could we figure out a way to address meals? And so that's where the system is today. In terms of small computer chip, talks to the pump and CGM. The algorithm is relatively sophisticated. So depending on the settings that the person gives it, they can choose to bolus or announce their meal or not.
And you keep talking about the small computer chip. About how large is that?
The size of a Tic Tac box or AirPod Pros,
Okay.
It's relatively small. There's now actually multiple open source systems, and some of them have to have this radio bridge to talk to the pumps because the pumps don't have Bluetooth capability. But there are some pumps internationally outside of the US that actually have Bluetooth built into them. So you could talk directly to an Android phone, for example, using Bluetooth and not need the radio chip. And the algorithm would be hosted on the phone. And then there's another open source version where the algorithm, a slightly different algorithm, is on an iPhone, for example, and still uses a little computer chip, but it's just for the radio. In OpenAPS, which is the thing I first built, the radio and the algorithm are on the computer chip, so you don't necessarily have to have a phone. So it's when I first built mine, that was the only choice because that's how we built it. But now there's options of, depending on which pump and CGM you have and where you live, do you have an iPhone, an Android? Do you want to carry something? Do you want to have a phone or not? There's lots of great options in the open source community.
Did you have a background in this before you started doing it? Or did
Absolutely
this just
not.
happen?
It just happened. I actually have a background in communications. My degree from college is in public relations and political science. And so I was working in health communications for a healthcare system. And the cool thing that I love about this story and OpenAPS is that when we sat down to do it, myself and my co-developer, who's now my husband, he is a technical person, but also didn't necessarily know programming. So we learned to program and build the system to do what we wanted to do, but we learned how to program. That was the hard part. The easy part was the diabetes part, and we learned how to program and figure that out and kind of learned as we went and over time. And it was actually me seeking out a solution to get the data off my CGM that introduced me to open source. I saw a tweet from a gentleman named John Kostick where he had figured out how to get CGM data off his son's CGM and into the cloud. And he wanted it for remote monitoring because his son was 3 or 4 years old at the time. But I wanted it for personal monitoring. But I reached out and said, would you share your code or help me figure out how to do this so I can take that data and make my louder alarm system? And he said, yes. And that was my first introduction to open source, this idea of people sharing code and ideas and information to be able to build something yourself. So once I realized that you could do that, you could share these cool solutions that you came up with, I was hooked. Once we had built the closed loop system myself and we knew we wanted to share it with other people, that's part of the reason that influenced our decision to make it open source, was that other people could read every line of code if they wanted to. They could add to it, modify it, do whatever they wanted, or build it themselves. So that was one of the things that got me into open source and recognizing that open source was really, really powerful.
You mentioned someone being able to build it themselves. How difficult do you think that would be to get done?
Today, with the documentation available and the community support, not that difficult. You don't have to know how to program yourself, but if you want to read every line of code, you absolutely can. If you want to plug in your own algorithm, you can. But most people, it's like a recipe where you get the ingredients, you get the components, you make sure your pump and CGM are compatible, and you can follow the directions. If you can follow a recipe, or if you can operate Facebook on a computer, you would be able to build the system for yourself. But you just have to decide that you want to do it. You will learn new things, absolutely. Things about how computers work, how communication like Bluetooth works between devices. But the most important thing is deciding that you want to do this yourself and that you're willing to build it and carry it with you. It's no different than deciding to learn how to switch from multiple daily injections to an insulin pump. There's a learning curve. You have to change your settings. You kind of have to figure out how to make it work for you. There's a learning curve of a couple of weeks or months. And not everybody wants to do that, and that's totally fine. But for those who choose to do it, it's absolutely possible for everybody who wants to.
Going into the actual details of the system, how did it change your blood sugars when you first started using it?
Oh, they were drastically different. I'll share a visual with you that you're welcome to post and include for podcast listeners. But I went from having highs and lows and highs and lows every single day, 3 or 4 times a day and night. I was high and low and ping-ponging back and forth and just so frustrated and so drained from the energy it took to deal with hypos and hypers and hypos and hypers. And the first night that I used the closed loop system and went to bed with it, my goal was just to have it for overnight. I wasn't even expecting to use it during the day, but I woke up the next morning and looked at my graph and it was a straight line. And it was the most beautiful thing that I've ever seen. And then I was like, I don't want to leave this at home. My plan was to leave it at home and go to work. And I put a battery on it and took it to work. So I was like, I want to see what it can do during the daytime too. And so it just drastically, overnights were beautiful. Daytimes were way better. It just did such a good job predicting into the future and adjusting insulin before even I would, if I was paying complete attention and not, working and living and sleeping and all these things, it did even better than I could because it was making small decisions every 5 minutes that were very easy to adjust insulin up and down. And it was just spectacular. And one of the things I love for me, what drove me to do this was I wanted a louder alarm because I was afraid of what would happen if I didn't hear my alarm and I had severe hypoglycemia because I lived by myself and there was nobody to help me if something went wrong. I had moved to Seattle for work after college and my backup plan was that I texted my mom every morning. And if she didn't hear from me by the designated time, she would call me. And if I didn't pick up the phone, she would call again and it never had to happen, thankfully. But the escalation plan was that she would call the apartment manager and they would come check on me. And I had a real fear of hypoglycemia in my sleep. And so the peace of mind and the safety of being able to go to sleep without fear for me was what those lines represent. It's not just, I feel physically better because I'm not dealing with hyper, but it represents just a huge weight off of my back and the mental burden of worrying about what would happen if I didn't wake up to the alarm.
With the closed loop system, do you need to change your basals or insulin to carb ratio, or does that take care of it with you?
The closed loop system uses your basal rates, your ISF, and your carb ratio as kind of like your starting numbers. And it uses that to do the math to decide, do you need more or less insulin at any given point in time? A lot of people, when they switch to a closed loop system, realize that they've been using numbers that were maybe not the most accurate to what their body needs right now. So it's very common for people to need to modify their settings. Again, it's part of that learning curve of updating your settings. I can give myself as an example of I hadn't changed my pump settings in 10 years when I started using a closed loop. And in OpenAPS, we actually built a system that would recommend changes to basal rates, ISF, and carb ratio, because we realized telling somebody that their settings were off when they asked us to look at their graphs and why they weren't getting the most optimal outcomes is really hard as a human to hear, like, your stuff is wrong, change it. But we built another little algorithm that would say, here's how off your basal rate is. For example, between midnight and 6 a.m., you might want to think about changing it. And people took that information better coming from the computer than from the humans. And people got better outcomes by changing their settings as a result of using that. It's called auto tune. So that's one example of things where you kind of have to adjust settings over time. Sometimes it's easier to do it bit by bit, and sometimes it's easier to have it built into the system to help change your settings over time based on what you need.
And another question to go along with that. How does meal bolusing work with this kind of system?
Originally, it was like any other system, hybrid closed loop, where you would enter your carbs and you would tell it how much insulin to give. And then the system would read that information and make any corrections around that based on if the blood sugar is predicted to go above or below range over time. We added capabilities to the system to match the capabilities of some of the faster insulins, where now some people can choose to do no bolus meals, where they might just enter the carbs that they're eating and let the system decide when and how much insulin to give. There's some people who don't announce what they're eating up to certain amounts. There's a really great story from the community of a teen for the last couple of years who's done no carb entry at all, eats 200 plus grams of carbs a day, does not bolus. Time in range is very reasonable. A1C is very ideal for a teen, and he's not doing any work. And like all he's doing is keeping the system in his pocket and the pump and CGM on the body. And it's working, what I would say, spectacularly well, especially for a teen who's going through puberty and growth and changes and everything. So that's one of the things that excites me is the flexibility for people to do what they want. There's some times where people are like, I want, perfectly flat line, no out of range blood sugars, and I'm willing to bolus and enter my carbs for it. Great. If you want to do that, do that. But if there's a time where you don't want to pull your phone out of your pocket or you don't want to fiddle with your pump, maybe you're going to prom, maybe you're on a date, like whatever reason you don't want to pull your pump out, the system is there to take care of it. If you don't enter carbs, or maybe you can enter something from your watch or your phone very discreetly, there's a lot of flexibility. And with these systems, instead of having to choose and commit to, am I going to do full no bolus, no carb announcement for the next 4 years? It's not a commitment to, like you have to choose the system in order to have these capabilities. It's built in. So like on a day-to-day or hourly basis, you can choose, do I want to enter carbs? Do I want to bolus? Yes or no, depending on how much work you want to do, what kinds of things are you eating, and are there other reasons why you may or may not want to bolus, for example? So you've got a lot more flexibility and you don't necessarily have to commit to one method or the other.
The flexibility in that is absolutely crazy to me, just because as someone who uses a pump and a Dexcom that do not communicate with each other, I know that I have to enter pretty much for everything that I'm eating in my system so I can provide insulin through it in my pump unless that I'm low. So hearing that there are so many options on this new system is just really wild.
Yeah. And I think we'll get there with commercial systems too. I think of the first commercial generation systems as like what I had when I first built my system. It's great as a hybrid closed loop system, but it still requires the human to probably enter carbs and bolus for pretty much everything that you eat, because it doesn't have the flexibility of those settings to be able to adjust for a sudden rise from a meal if it doesn't know about the carbs. Like it's just not designed to be able to dose the insulin to adjust for that. With the closed loop systems, the open source ones were there. And I think eventually the commercial systems will get there too in the next couple of generations. So for people who have chosen commercial closed loop systems and they're hearing about that, like I think it is in the future pipeline. I don't work for those companies, so I can't say for sure, but that's what I love about open source, is it kind of shows us where the commercial tech can end up. So I think hopefully that flexibility, on a day-to-day basis is there for everybody in the future who wants closed loop, whether it's commercial or open source.
So along with the carb counting and having that almost be completely eradicated from a daily life, another question that I have is, will the devices know when a pump is out? Will you have some sort of alert that tells you this, or will there be any evidence? Because I know just wearing a pump every day, sometimes there'll be a pump that doesn't work, or it's just out of my arm or leg or wherever else it is. Will there be a way to tell this on the system that you're using now and that you've created?
So in OpenAPS, we built a feature called auto sensitivity, or AutoSense for short, that can detect kind of short-term changes to sensitivity and resistance to insulin for whatever reason. It could be that you just ran a marathon and you're very, very sensitive to insulin. It could be that your pump site is a couple days too old or is just occluded for whatever reason. And so it doesn't tell you your pump site is occluded, you need to change it, but it starts adjusting insulin a little bit more quickly to respond to either that sensitivity or resistance. And then it's possible that you could basically add a series of alarms that said, okay, if you're at max resistance for X period of time, alarm me so I can think about changing my pump site. Most people would notice before then, because you would notice that by checking your, CGM twice a day, you would notice that you've been running a little bit higher, maybe still in range. But for me, running high and resistant is now 150 milligrams per deciliter, where it used to be like 250 would be what I would call running high and resistant. For me now, 150 and not coming down for hours would be like, hey, there's something going on. And I would think about my pump site. How old is it? Check it. Obviously, if you're running through the roof, probably check your pump and say, oh, it fell out or it got ripped out, and to change it. I'm hoping that some future modern pump sets and pumps will be able to tell us, hey, it appears the insulin is not going into your body, based on some technology in the pump site. But with the current pump sites, we don't have that. But there's things that you can look at in your data in the system, like on your phone, that give you a quicker clue of, hey, something is not that great. And that's one of the things I like about auto sensitivity is I am much quicker to detect that a pump site's not as great as they usually are, especially around like day 1.5 to 2. Like normally I change my pump sets every 3-ish days, depending on when my reservoir goes low. But it used to be that it would take me until day 3 before I was ready to pull the pump site and say, yeah, the pump site's the problem. But now I can more reliably, because of this resistance detector, figure out it's probably worth changing my pump site, even if it's only been 36 hours. It's worth changing. And so it gets me to change it a little bit sooner, just because I have that data that shows me I'm not imagining things. I am running a little bit higher, even though like maybe to some people listening, 150 doesn't sound high at all. But if I'm used to running below 120, like that actually is a pretty big difference for me. And so it just triggers me to check it sooner and take action sooner.
So another thing that I know about your closed loop system is that you openly share all of the information on that. When did you decide to start doing that?
So we pretty much knew that other people were going to try to close the loop. And we had spent, because I had done the louder alarm system with the algorithm, I had that algorithm done and testing for a year before we actually closed the loop and had it automatically talk to the pump. And we had put in a lot of safety measures into the algorithm about how much it could dose, safety scenarios based on what your blood sugar were, all the safety engineering into the system. And we felt like if we started talking about how I was closing the loop for myself and using it and not sharing it, other people would try to recreate the wheel, but maybe not have done the same level of safety engineering or thought about all the edge cases that we had discovered in the year of open loop testing. So we felt like the community would be safer as a result of us sharing that, even if they didn't use our stuff directly, being able to see what we did and how we did it and why we made decisions. So we kind of pretty much decided from day one, as soon as we got it working and felt like it was something that we could share, we would. So I closed the loop for myself like the end of November or the first week of December in 2014. And we had shared everything publicly by, I think, February 1st of 2015. So that was just like cleaning up our code and being able to put it online in a way that people could read it and use it. And then over time, we as a community have felt better about how do we help people learn how to use the system, like what's most important. What's most important is that they know their diabetes and they know how the system works at a high level, like how it talks to the pump and CGM, how the safety engineering works, but you don't necessarily need to know how to program in order to safely use the system. And so the community's added documentation that again is like following a recipe to help community members use the system if they want to use it. And so that community documentation has evolved over time as well.
That's just all crazy to me. So along with that, did you have any concerns about legal liability that could result from sharing what you know with the community?
We did, and that was part because when I first had my louder alarm prediction algorithm, I shared it at a conference, and there were representatives from the FDA there who came up to me afterwards and said, "Tell me more about the system." And I said, "Oh, it takes my CGM data, runs it through this algorithm, gives me alerts, suggests things for me to do, and I'm going to share it online because I think it would help other people. And I think they should know what I did and how I did it in case they want to do it themselves too." And the response was, "Well, you are making dosing recommendations off of a class 3 medical device, which is the CGM. The CGM is not FDA approved for dosing insulin off of at the time. You shouldn't do that because you would be distributing a class 3 medical device." And I went, I'm not trying to distribute a medical device. I'm just trying to share what I did and let other people do it. And so I was actually scared off of sharing my first open loop system back in the day, because at that point there was no Night Scout, there was no open source diabetes community where there was like this community norm of sharing code like that. And so I didn't, but we talked to a lot of legal experts who pointed out that as individuals, we have the right to free speech. And so because we are not a commercial company, we're not selling anything. We've never made any money off of this. We're not distributing anything. We're not selling whatever. Like, we as individuals have the right to write blogs and documentation. We can also share our code as individuals under our free speech rights. So by the time we had gotten to the point of realizing we could close the loop and we were going to do it, we made the decision that we were going to share it open source. Again, for the reasons I mentioned, we thought it would make the community safer for other people trying to do this. But we also felt like we as individuals had the right to do that as free speech. And so we chose to do that. And we've had subsequent conversations with the FDA, of course, about this. They read my blog. They know all about this community. They're very connected with the community. But that's kind of what influenced our choice to do it and to stick with it. And that's part of the reasons why we did not try to create a company or do anything like that or get donations from people, because we did not want to be accused of distributing by receiving money for anything that we did, a medical device.
I do have to ask, I know that you mentioned feedback there as well. What kind of feedback have you received from sharing this information?
It's been really positive. Not everybody wants to build a system for themselves, which totally understand and I respect. There's this great phrase, why DMB? Your diabetes may vary. What the tools that you want to use to treat your diabetes. Some people like CGM, some people hate it. Some people want pumps, some people want MDI, some people want a closed loop, some people don't. Some people want to build it themselves. Some people want a commercial system. I am all for choices. So I think that's great. So I think we had some skeptical responses more from the medical community at first. The diabetes community loved the idea of people building something that did not even exist commercially. It took 2.5 more years after we launched OpenAPS for the first commercial system to become available in the US. And there's still countries around the world that don't have commercially available closed loop systems. So open source is the only option for them. So we've gotten a lot of great feedback from people who just love the idea that the community is able to generate and share knowledge amongst ourselves in a way that's like really effective. Over time, we've also gotten additional feedback from healthcare providers once they learned about it. And there's been research that we and others have done on it showing that this is no less safe than standalone pump and CGM. It's comparable to the commercial closed loop outcomes, et cetera, et cetera. So we've gotten both positive and constructive criticism from not only the diabetes community, but the medical community. But over time, you also just start to hear more stories of not just me. I was the first. So at first, my story was the only story out there, but now there's thousands of people worldwide using these different open source systems, and they did it for different reasons. Some people do it because they want to prepare and have a healthy pregnancy with type 1 diabetes. Other people want to be able to manage their diabetes and not do anything, like the teen that I had talked about who does no bolus, no carbs. There's people like me who did it because I want to sleep safely. There's other people who do it and do all kinds of amazing ultra marathon running endurance, other physical endurance things. Like there's so many great stories out there. And that's what I love to hear is people who've taken this technology and made it work to help them meet their goals in their life. So instead of having to spend a lot of time doing diabetes is taken care of for the most part, and they can, live their life.
Yeah. So you also talked about there being just so many people who use it for so many different purposes. Is there an age range that you'd put on this, or can anyone of any age with type 1 use this?
So if you were a company, they would have a legal age range where it's approved for based on their studies and everything. I'm not making claims here because I'm not a company and I'm not a doctor, but I can tell you what I have observed in the community, which is we've seen parents put it on their kid who were below 1 year old, so several months old with diabetes. And I've known people up into their 80s who are using it. So really young babies, toddlers, kids, adolescents, teens, young adults, older adults. It really comes down to, do you have access to a pump and a CGM? Can you run the system? Can you wear the system? Do you want to wear the system? And so for a lot of parents, especially with kids who can't necessarily articulate, are they high or low or how they're feeling? A lot of parents, actually the second person who chose to build this after myself, did it for his son, who I believe was a preteen at the time. And he could fully communicate that he was high or low or whatever, but the dad felt like this would do a better job than they would at managing blood sugar levels. So there's always been quite a few kids and younger people whose parents have helped build the system and used it as a family, as well as people like me who built it as adults and use it themselves.
You're so great to just share this information about the closed loop with everyone here. But you've also spoken, I know, at a lot of conferences and on a lot of podcasts other than this one. Were you always comfortable with public speaking, or did experience with type 1 and building this system help you with that?
So I was diagnosed at age 14, and I gave my first speech as a diabetes fundraiser thing, I think around within a year. So I was 14 or 15 for the first one. And so I did more public speaking as a result of having diabetes than I may have otherwise. And so by the time I got around to doing closed loop and open APS through my work, I also had tons of speaking experience. So I was relatively comfortable with that. But obviously I've done, as you mentioned, different podcasts and conferences and talks and stuff, as a result of open APS, and done a lot more, and everything gets a little bit easier with practice. So I think it's a little bit of both. It's kind of funny to me that I don't know that I would have spoken so much publicly had I not had diabetes, but that comfort led to me being willing to speak and communicate about open APS, in part because I recognized that, not everybody was involved in the same online communities that I was with diabetes. I would post to my blog and Twitter and Facebook and whatever, but I wanted people elsewhere who aren't plugged in or don't think about themselves as part of the quote diabetes online community to learn about this and know that this technology is coming commercially. It's available open source if you want to do that. So that was always one of my goals and one of the things that I really wanted to do, in addition to continuing to make the system better. So that's one of the things that I definitely try to do more and more of intentionally.
Yes, I just know that my family and I, we often discuss the positive side of type 1, like talking to people you never would have, because there wouldn't have been a reason to other than type 1. Have you found yourself with any of those experiences through the ALS system?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that actually a lot of my closest friends now are people with diabetes who I would have never had a chance to meet. And also I've met a lot of other patients, people who are advocates for their health condition as a result of talking about living with diabetes. And they're also some of my greatest friends who I never would have met as a result of having diabetes. And I always say, if I hadn't had diabetes, I wouldn't have done XYZ. I wouldn't have done something in college that moved me out to Seattle. And I wouldn't have met my husband. Maybe if we hadn't done open APS, we wouldn't have fallen in love. I don't know. There's just like diabetes feels very integrated into my life story. But one of the best things about it is absolutely the people and the community that you get to meet and the community that you get to opt into and build.
I also saw a biography on DIYPS.org that you were invited to the White House and a conference held in the European Parliament. Could you tell us about that? That sounds really interesting.
Yeah, the White House was there was a couple of White House events. One was the White House Frontiers Conference. And there was also a participatory medicine workshop at the White House that I got to go and sit in, which was really awesome. And then the European Parliament was an invitation to share my story, give a presentation, but also be part of a panel discussion. And that was interesting because obviously I am a US citizen, and so I was not necessarily a European, but I got to be a part of that panel with different citizens across Europe who talked about living with cochlear implants, for example, or other health conditions. And we kind of talked about the different global cultures in terms of innovations and patients' ability to do things for themselves, what we call DIY, do it yourselves, or this concept of citizen science, whether that's a patient thing or just it's a scientific experiment you do as a untrained person in the community. So there's like a lot of these great events that just bring together people that you would never have a chance to meet from kind of a cross section of geography or a cross section of healthcare, for example, that have been just such an honor to participate in. I don't speak on behalf of all people with type 1 diabetes. And I always try to make that very, very clear. I can share my story. I can share stories from the community on their behalf, but there's no one answer. There's no right answer. And I think too, as we look at, different problems and challenges across healthcare, our perspective as people living with type 1 diabetes might be different than some of our friends who are living with cancer or asthma or cystic fibrosis. Like there's a lot of challenges with the healthcare system, whether we're talking about dealing with device companies or insurance or regulation of these devices and drugs, that I think it just shows that there's a lot of opportunities to change. And there's a lot of great people out there trying to create change.
I also know that you've written a book. How did you find the time to write it, and what was the experience like writing it? But also, can you just tell us about the book in general as well?
Yeah, so the book is called Automated Insulin Delivery: How Artificial Pancreas Closed Loop Systems Can Aid You in Living with Diabetes. And my goal with that book was to write something that really captured all the knowledge that I and the community have learned from years of living with closed loop systems, recognizing again that not everybody's going to use open source systems, but a lot of what we've learned, like how to even use this technology in your life, also applies to commercial closed loop systems. So the book tells a little bit of my story of why I built the first open source system and talks about the differences between open source and commercial closed loop systems, but it kind of takes a step back and talks higher level about what does a closed loop even do? Why would you choose it? Like, why is it an option for people with diabetes if they can access it in their country and afford it? And then also there's information in there about kind of really optimizing the technology to work for you, whether you're running marathons, experiencing pregnancy, whatever it is that you're doing in your life. And there's a chapter for healthcare providers that helps hopefully healthcare providers think about how this technology could work for patients and hopefully get them more comfortable with it, open source or commercial, because it's a learning curve for them as well, compared to standalone pump and CGM that don't talk to each other. There were concerns early on that, oh no, these closed loop systems are going to take away the doctor's job. Absolutely not. It just takes away stuff that they didn't want to even be doing and gives them more time to focus on the bigger picture health questions for people with diabetes. So it's kind of a general purpose book that was kind of fun to write, but also challenging because I broke my ankle 2 years ago. And I had this idea for the book in my head, but during the first couple of weeks of recovery, I just sat there with my leg propped up and my laptop on my lap and just wrote it in about a course of a week, just got the first draft out there. And it was kind of a good time to do it because I couldn't go anywhere, couldn't do anything. And it was nice to get all of those ideas out of my head and onto paper and to start turning it into a book. And it's available online for free. So you can go to artificialpancreasbook.com, read it for free, or download a PDF for free. If you want it in print form, you can buy it on Amazon or get a Kindle copy, but it's available open source as well for anybody who wants to access it.
So with the closed loop systems that are on the market right now, would you say that those are truly closed loop, or are they more of a hybrid system just because you would still have to enter the carbs on one of those?
Yeah, most of the first generation systems that are commercially available are hybrid closed loop systems. So to get the best outcomes, you need to enter carb estimates and do some level of bolusing for it. With open source systems, like we talked about, you can use different types of insulin. There's different settings that you can do. And then based on your preferred outcomes and tolerance for going in and out of range, you can choose to do carbs, not do carbs, bolus, not do bolus. There are some people who've done unannounced meals or no carb entry on the commercial systems. I haven't used that, so I can't talk about that experience personally, but I also think that type of flexibility is coming, hopefully, in the future commercial systems. So hopefully we'll get more of that in the future.
Okay, so going along with that, are there things that you can do on the do-it-yourself APS system that are not available in a commercial system? For example, can you set low blood sugar alarms in the DIY system?
Yeah, so there's a lot of flexibility in terms of alarms and also targets. That's one obvious differentiator in the DIY systems. And in fact, we've been a proponent of using lower targets ahead of meals to get insulin going more quickly, but also at safe levels. That way your body is primed to deal with the carbs when you actually eat them. And then that makes sure your mealtime insulin dosing, whether you do a manual bolus or the system does it, more effective because there's already insulin activity working in your body. So there's different features like that, like the ability to set a slightly lower than usual target, but still a safe one. So like maybe your target's normally 100, but maybe you set a lower target to 80 for an hour before you eat. You get some insulin activity going, you don't cause hypoglycemia, and then you're less likely to get a spike after a meal, regardless of what you're eating. So there's features like that. There's a lot of flexibility in terms of how and where you see your data. So for example, I see my data on my watch. I use a Pebble watch. I've got my data displayed. I can access it on my phone through a number of different apps and tools. I can use my phone to tell the system to change my target or what I'm eating. So I don't necessarily have to pull out my pump to do dosing and things like that. And then there's also a lot of algorithm features. Like I mentioned, auto sensitivity, which is a feature that can kind of tell you and automatically adjust dosing based on whether you're a little more sensitive or resistant compared to normal. Those are the kind of advanced features that we have that, again, I think will hopefully come out in terms of kind of advanced algorithms in the next generation commercial systems. We'll get there. But in the meantime, that's currently a difference between the open source systems and the commercial systems. It's just a lot of different algorithm features, a lot of different usability and data portability features that right now aren't built into the commercial systems.
Can you tell us about the study that you did that was funded by Diabetes Mind last year and why that data is important?
So last year, Amy Tendrick of Diabetes Mind had this idea of looking at the learning curve of the commercial closed loop systems. And she asked me to do that study. I kind of switched my quote unquote day job into a variety of research projects because of my research experience with open source community. But this was the first time that I did a study looking at commercial closed loops. I got to talk to a bunch of members of the diabetes community who have used the different commercial systems available across the world at the time. So that was the Medtronic 670G, Control IQ, and CAM APS, which is one that's available, I think, in the UK and parts of Europe. And what was really interesting is when you talk to people about what their expectations were generally met with these first generation commercial hybrid closed loop systems because they expected them to be hybrid closed loop systems and not, the magic cure for diabetes. So the people I talked to happened to have reasonable expectations and therefore felt that their expectations were met. But some of the different people talked about different struggles that they had with the systems. And so it was really eye-opening to be able to share that information back with the community and the commercial manufacturers to say, okay, across these systems, here are the themes that people talked about in terms of the ease of learning it, getting started with it, dealing with communication alarms between the pump and the CGM, for example. That can be a source of frustration, both in open source and in commercial, and people weren't expecting it to be an issue in commercial, and it was for some of the systems. And then likewise, alarms from the CGM and how you calibrate the CGM or don't, and its ability to then be in closed loop or auto mode. That was a source of frustration. And so it was just a really great kind of high level view into, okay, if you think about the learning and the onboarding process and recognizing there's a learning curve with all this technology, there's kind of some universal usability themes that we hope as a result of this study, the commercial manufacturers think about in terms of designing the experience and designing the technology for their next generation.
So I also saw on your Twitter feed that you're a runner. So how did you start running? Did you have any training? Were you involved in any programs before this, or did you just start on your own?
I just started on my own. I mean, when I was a kid, my brother was a super fast runner. He did cross country and track. He was really great. I was not a fast runner. And so I didn't ever really try. But as an adult, I decided that one of the things that I wanted to do was to run a marathon, and I couldn't run at all. So I had to start somewhere. I worked my way up and ran a marathon in 2013 and then was done. I did not run for several years. But then in the last couple of years, thought running would be a good source of regular exercise, and I got back into it a little bit. Then I decided that I didn't push myself hard enough in my first marathon, and I wanted to do a second one. So I kind of set my mind of I'll do a second one and I'll train properly this time now that I have a little bit of running experience, not a lot, but like 50 miles a year is better than zero. And then I broke my ankle falling off a mountain in New Zealand. And
oh no,
recovering from that made me I've always been stubborn, but that made me more committed to like, I'm going to prove to myself that I've fully recovered from my broken ankle and I'm really going to run the marathon and train and do that. That was 2019. So my plan was to run in 2019. Then I broke my ankle. So I postponed to 2020, COVID, that got postponed. And so this year was the year that I trained successfully and ran my marathon 2 weeks ago in July 2021 and got it done.
Yes.
Yay.
So how many miles did you run before that in preparation?
So starting in January, I was running about twice a week, built up to 3 times a week, 4 times a week. And in total, I did 575 miles training before the race.
Wow.
Yeah,
that is definitely a lot
for me. It was a lot. It took a lot of time because I'm very slow.
When you are running, do you have any go-to things that you bring with you in case your blood sugar does go low?
Yeah, I found that for me, soft peppermints individually wrapped work really well because usually I try to not start my run with insulin on board. And so if I don't start with insulin on board, I'm unlikely to go low, in the first bit of running. What's going to happen is I might go low over time once the activity really kicks in. And so oftentimes I just need 3 or 4 carbs and that's enough. And so that's a single soft peppermint that I can eat. So I just generally shove my phone, my open APS rig in my pocket. My other pocket has my AirPod case and a bunch of peppermints. And I look kind of weird on the side of my shorts because I have all these peppermints bulging out, but that's what I need. And then for longer runs, kind of once I got over half marathon distance, I had a running pack that had, a Camelback full of water and infinite more peppermints and Smarties and all this other stuff. But for short runs, I just need a couple of peppermints.
If you're planning to run, let's give an example like a marathon, what do you do with the closed loop system? Do you override it, or is that able to keep up with what you're doing?
So there's different approaches that people can take. I've done both manual and with the closed loop, and there's different benefits to both. With a closed loop, you can set a high temporary target. So if you're like normally your target's 100, maybe you set your target to 130 or 150 for long periods of time. And then as it doses insulin or does predictions, it targets that. And then I also have a special exercise mode in mind that also changes my settings automatically for me. So I don't have to think about, oh, my basal rate should be X instead of Y, and my correction ratio changes because, like trying to fill that out is hard. And every given day it could be different. So the system can take care of that. I've also done it with manual mode where I leave the rig at home and I just set my insulin down to about a third of what I would normally need. And assuming that I don't go into it with any IOB, that kind of matches out with the intensity that I'm running. Might need a peppermint here or there. But when I'm running low intensity, pretty slow for training runs, I can go 5 to 6 hours without necessarily needing any carbs. And that's managed to work well for me. But that's because I have spent a lot of time running now. I know my body, I know my settings. My body's used to this slow running. When I first started running back in 2013, or when I ran intermittently and the other years, because my body wasn't used to it, I felt like I fought hypoglycemia way more. And part of that was because I didn't understand insulin timing as well as I do now. So it's worth learning about insulin activity curves if you don't know about them, because your insulin doesn't all work 100% the moment that you inject it or hit a button on your pump. Once it's in your skin, it starts working over time, but the peak activity is usually around 45 to 60 minutes. And then it tails off upwards of 5, 6, 7 hours. And so even if you dosed insulin an hour before you went, that would be hitting about the time that you start running. And so for a lot of people, if you go low right about the time you start running or in the first half hour, oftentimes it can be related to the insulin that you dosed half an hour before you went. And it's not always possible to do so. But one of the things I tried really, really hard this year to do so is to plan my runs always at least 2 hours after breakfast or after a meal, or change what I was eating and change my dosing so I didn't have that insulin hitting at the start or near the front of the run. Not always possible for people, but I found that for me, the reason I had hypoglycemia pretty constantly with all my other runs in past years was because of that insulin timing and not being able to plan ahead with my runs. If you have the luxury of planning ahead and timing your runs, I found personally that works a lot better for me to reduce hypoglycemia.
Can you tell us about your actual experience running the marathon? Like, where was it held? What time did you start? And how many hours did you actually run?
So I did a marathon that was on this beautiful trail in Washington State here. It's one of the railroad grade trails. So it was a 2% downhill grade all the way, which is a fantastic way to run a marathon. You're out in nature. You get to see mountains. You're on a 6-foot wide gravel trail, so people have good space to run around you. My trail was from Hyack to North Bend, Washington. And we started at 6:30 a.m., which meant I woke up at 3:30 to leave by 4:30 to get there by 5:30 to start at 6:30. And then because I am a very, very slow runner. My first marathon was about 6.5 hours back in 2013 when I felt like I didn't push myself hard enough. Pushed myself this time and I did below 6 hours. So I finished around 12:30 after starting at 6:30 and was very pleased to have pushed myself. That was fast for me and I was pleased with my outcomes, but I was also very glad to be done.
Yes, that's what I can imagine. So what did you do after the marathon? Like, how did you manage to like cool down and just prepare to go on with the rest of your life from that? Because I feel like that's such an experience.
It is such an experience. We were lucky temperature wise. A couple of weeks ago in early July, we had a record breaking heat wave in Seattle where it hit 108. And I did not run those days where it was over 100 degrees. I did one long run where I started at 80 degrees and ended at like 93 degrees. And that was brutal. But for the marathon itself, I think it was 65 degrees at the start and 77 at the finish Fahrenheit, which is just perfect marathon weather. So I didn't feel overly hot, thank goodness. But as soon as you cross the finish line, they hand you your medal, a bottle of water, and they did a washcloth soaked in a tub of icy water And so just like, using that cool washcloth to wipe all the salt and sweat and everything off your face and body does wonders for cooling you down. So I focused on getting hydration in. And then we actually had to jump in the car and drive to an outdoor memorial for my husband's family. And so like it was, get my hydration, get myself wiped down, get in the car, and then like eat snacks in the car and figure out how I'm going to change, and then, put my mask back on and go to the memorial outside, and then drive home, and then finally get to shower. I didn't necessarily do post-marathon cool down and everything the way I would have had we not had that event that we needed to get to as well on the same day. But I would say if you're ever running a long distance race, I had never had that cold washcloth to wash down with after the race. Have one in your car if they don't do it, because I highly recommend it. It just makes you feel like a new person.
In your experience, does having to run a long distance affect your blood sugar 24 hours or longer later? Because I've definitely heard that before with that much activity.
Yeah, your sensitivity definitely changes. And depending on how used you are to the activity, how long the activity is, there's all these variables that do it. And thankfully, because I have open APS, I don't have to calculate all those variables now and respond to it. I just make sure my rig is powered and charged and near me, and I don't have to think about it. I might set a slightly higher temporary target than my normal target. If my normal target is usually 100, I schedule 110 target just to give me a little bit more buffer for the 12 hours afterwards. That way, especially if I'm eating and still really insulin sensitive, the system knows, okay, don't be quite as ambitious as it would normally. But that's kind of like one of the night and day differences between my 2013 marathon, didn't have open APS, had to do everything myself during and after the race. I had to worry about the post-race hypoglycemia effect. Now with all of my runs, like during my race or during my runs, don't really worry about my blood sugars. Afterwards, open APS is going to mop up any extra insulin sensitivity. Auto sensitivity says, hello, insulin sensitive compared to normal. And it just adjusts automatically for me. And that's one of the things I'm really grateful for, is having a closed loop system that can respond so quickly and so well, so that whether you're, again, resistant or sensitive, it doesn't matter. It's going to take care of it for you.
Sounds amazing. I've seen you post about some of your pets. Would you like to talk about them on this podcast?
I have 2 adorable kittens. They're now over a year old, but I'm always going to call them kittens. Their name are Mint Julep and Mimosa, and we call them Mint and Mo.
Are they indoor or outdoor cats?
They are indoor cats, in part because we live in an apartment, and in part because Mint has what's called wobbly cat syndrome, which is cerebellar hypoplasia, which just means that she has poor proprioception, and sometimes she kind of wobbles or falls over. Super minor, but cats like that need to be indoor cats. But we also have this amazing balcony outside of our apartment that we've got fenced, so they can't stick their heads through or fall through or anything. And so they love going out on the balcony every day and watching the birds, looking at the flowers, looking at the people. So it's really fun to watch them outside.
They sound very cute.
For more cat pictures, look at my Twitter. It's outdoor walking and running pictures, cat pictures, occasional diabetes blog posts.
What is the best advice that you have received while living with type 1?
Ooh, that's a good question. When I decided to run a marathon, I started Googling marathon running with type 1 diabetes, ultra running with type 1 diabetes, and thankfully found blog posts from people who had done it before me and talked about nutrition and fueling and blood sugar management and things like that. And, as I went from teen years to planning to go to college, there are blog posts and people who gave really good advice about that. And, the family dynamics of how do you work with your parents as you grow up with diabetes, and how do you take over more management and keep good relationship and communication with them. And then once I fell in love and got married, relationship, within your household with a partner or a spouse, there's relationship dynamics there with diabetes. And so I feel like kind of on all those topics, I've gotten really great advice, but there's no one single piece of advice. But I think probably maybe the advice I got and took advantage of is to reach out online, to join a community if one exists, create one if you don't feel like the right community exists for you. Social media and online internet technology, I feel like gives us an advantage, especially now in a pandemic, because you don't have to be geographically near somebody to be friends with them or connect with them. So I feel like inadvertently that's advice that I probably got that was the best that led to all my other really good advice. And that's the advice I'd give other people too.
Perfect. Just to close out, I want to reference a quote of yours from a small conference in Seattle a few years ago. Here it is. I'm not a rocket scientist or an engineer. I'm not really unique. I'm just a girl living with type 1 diabetes who got tired of waiting. And I just want to say, on the behalf of the type 1 diabetes community, we are all so thankful that you were tired of waiting. You were such an inspiration for teenagers and young adults in our community. Thank you for showing us that we do not need a title to make a difference. We just have to take the first step and the next step and the step after that until we make the world a better place for all of us. what I'm learning from doing this podcast is that we all have something to offer to the type 1 diabetes community. Just as the motto on the DIYPS.org website states, we are not waiting to make the world a better place. Thank you so much for agreeing to be here, Dana.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for what you're doing, and for anybody listening who is doing what they can, where they can to help the diabetes community. Thank you too.
Yes, thank you. That's all for today. If you have any suggestions for future topics or guests, or just want to say hi, don't hesitate to reach out. You can email me at teen.t1d@gmail.com or DM me on Instagram at teen1dpodcast. If you like my podcast, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review, as it really does help me out. Thanks so much for listening, and don't forget to tune in to next week's episode. Have a great week, and that's all. See ya.